Rick is a longtime reporter, journalist. He used to work in Latin America for a number of U.S. papers. He was with the Sacramento Bee. He was with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which a lot of you will know through, say, the Panama Papers, you might have heard of, or the Paradise Papers. So he was with them. He was at 100 Reporters, the parent organization of Double Exposure, as managing editor for a while. And he was also on the 100 Reporters board briefly, so he's kind of worn, I think, every hat that we have in our closet. He's also a founder of Palabra, which is an organization that is for freelancers who are members of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. It's the only digital publication that is created by an affinity group and for readers who are interested in their work, which spans an array of topics, and you can visit at Palabra. I'm going to let Rick take it away from here and just say also that he came in as a sponsor for yesterday's discussion and today's, and for that we also thank him.
Thank you, and welcome, and thank you, Diana. Just seeing the program now, seeing DX now, 10 years later, remembering the sweat equity that went into that very first screening of Spotlight 10 years ago. And that was just a really good augur of things to come. And it's amazing to see the maturation. Let's do another 10 wonderful years, all right? This time, in this iteration of DX, I'm really proud to be not just a moderator, but also a sponsor, a co-sponsor. Every year, I get a modest budget from PBS to do engagement and outreach. And this year I thought, what better outreach to the creatives that participate in public media across the country? And how can we, both reflect some of the sentiment that's going on in the industry, but also get at what I'm faced with day in and day out as the public editor, are dozens of emails and texts and messages and social media outreach from audiences, all right? So I get all of the concerns, complaints, and questions. And it's beautiful. I mean, my career is as an investigative reporter, and I've been surprised over the last 5 years how much of those skills I've had to employ to dive into the PBS universe and suss out situations that arise, explore questions, examine complaints, and it's actually a pretty exciting, pretty thrilling job. And I have to also mention like I said yesterday, I'm one of just a handful of public editors. And today, more than any time that I can think of in recent times, I've been a journalist for 45 years now, professional journalist, and I got to tell you, we need more institutions to have folks like me being the go-between between audiences and the institutions that rely on these audiences. So, welcome here. The reason why we're doing this today is a couple of years ago, I wrote a column that asked a question. How did Rick Steves become Rick Steves at PBS, right? And I have to qualify it immediately by this caveat. PBS is probably not what you think it is. PBS is not a network like, say, CBS or NBC that has owned and operated stations all over the country. PBS is a platform. It's a place where creatives from around the world can come together and seek a way to get in front of public media audiences, right? So PBS does not directly own a majority of the programming. A lot of it comes from other entities, ITVS. It comes from the individual stations. GBH runs and owns Frontline. WETA runs and operates NewsHour, and PBS News is now becoming an umbrella around that, but it's all done, a lot of it is done through the power of the local stations, right? So today we're going to have two examples, I think, of ways people, creatives, can get into this public media system. And I'm not going to limit it to just PBS. I'm also going to say, remind you that there's American Public Media. There's a number of different avenues and channels that you can explore, that you can perhaps exploit. and see about getting your work into the public media space. It's certainly not the two definitive ways that you'll see today, but it's two ways that I think can be examples of how folks began from, I'm not going to say zero because they're two talented individuals and they had a lot of good stuff, but from a point A to now the level of success that they would like to profess. It's either successful or we have a lot more work to do, right? But it's cracking the code. And for the majority of creatives out there, there is a code that needs to be cracked. But just a reminder, it's not simply the PBS code. It's a code of how you get your creative product before the people who can help you find distribution. And there's a number of ways to do it. We're going to have one way that we're going to talk about is through the local stations. And then another is through entities like Latino Public Broadcasting and PBS itself, right? Finding support within the organization. So we're not going to have all of the answers, but I really, these two filmmakers who we have with us today, I think will give you really be good representatives of the creatives out there. So why don't you come on up, Bernardo Ruiz and Kim Haas. And I'll go back to the question I asked a couple of years ago, which became a column. One of my columns on my page at PBS was, how did Rick Steves get to be Rick Steves in the public media system? Well, the reason why I asked that is because I was meeting with a group of Afro-Latino journalists from Latin America, and some of them had seen the work that was being started by Kim Haas. And I was taken to task because they were wondering, why isn't Kim Haas on more local stations? Why isn't she like Rick Steves? So I thought, maybe I should ask Rick Steves. And so I did. And what the answers I got really astounded me because I found almost a mirror of Kim's experience in Rick Steves' origin stories. And that's why I had what I thought was a pretty interesting Q&A with the two of them and talking about Kim's story, which really looks like a lot like Rick Steves' origin story. So that created this question, how do we get in? How do we get into the system? And at the end of that column, I made a couple of recommendations. PBS is under no obligation to follow my recommendations, because what the hell do I know? But one of them was, we need to make the system more transparent. We need, like in Major League Baseball, an outstanding farm system where we're investing heavily in creatives who are just starting out or who don't have a Ken Burns-style entree into the system, all right? And just a quick note so to clarify it even more. I've heard a lot of criticism about Ken Burns and even Rick Steves. These guys, they're white guys and they get so much from PBS. Let me tell you what Rick Steves and Ken Burns actually do for PBS. They are net money and income revenue generators, not just for PBS, but for the local stations. So when you see their productions, in a way, you have to kind of thank them, I think, for the openings they create and the abilities they create public media to then help other creatives in the system. So that's all I'll say about that. But let me start by introducing Kim Haas, all right? And Kim Haas is going to tell you a little bit more about her, and we're going to see a little clip of what she's been up to.
Thank you, Ricardo. Hola. Oh, gosh, everybody, hi. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So, yeah, I'll make it real short in terms of just a brief intro. I grew up wanting to always study Spanish. I majored in Spanish in school, undergraduate, graduate school, middle school, high school. It was all about Spanish. And I knew I wanted to combine that with my love of TV and film. And I worked at Telemundo several years ago before I started this journey. And I traveled a lot throughout Latin America. Any Latin Americans here? Hola, okay, que bien. And I was watching television even at Telemundo, and I was looking around because I traveled to Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, Cuba, and I'm meeting all these people who look like me. But then I'm Telemundo, Univision, and there's no one. And I'm thinking about all this incredible talent that is in these communities, and specifically arts and culture, and how much people of African descent have contributed to Latin America. It is absolutely astounding. And the fact that there is very little programming that celebrates blacks in Latin America really is shameful. Because 1 in 3 Latin Americans are of African descent, and they feel absolutely invisible. And I just decided that I wanted to make it as part of my life's work to really celebrate these incredible people. And so that's what it's all about. So that's the journey I'm on, and I just absolutely adore it. I love it. I get so much out of it. I learn so much. And I hope that I can be part of this movement to bring greater visibility of people of African descent to the world. And so that's how this whole thing got started.
All right, so let's see a little.
Sure. So any Colombians in particular? No? No Colombians? I married one. Okay, that counts. So this is a clip of me interviewing Nidia Góngora, and she is an Afro-Colombian. The series, again, celebrates blacks in Latin America. And this is in Cali, and she's a singer, so you can see a little bit.
Before we begin, just one point of data. In the U.S., 25% of Latinos, and that's a pretty sizable population, 25% of Latinos, according to Pew, self-identify as Afro-Latino. So that just gives you the potential of this market, the potential of this community.
The Afro-Colombian population is rich in cultural heritage thanks to oral history passed down over the decades. Nidia Góngora teaches the art and skill of storytelling and Pacific music at the Cañalón School, preserving ancestral knowledge for a new generation.
Nidia, qué placer estar aquí contigo. No sé dónde vamos a empezar.
Bueno, pues por el principio, por Timbiquí.
Timbiquí es el principio, claro que sí, claro que sí.
Timbiquí es un municipio que queda ubicado en el suroccidente del Pacífico colombiano, una comunidad donde mayoritariamente habitan afrodescendientes e indígenas, y es mi pueblo precisamente el que me ha dado las mayores alegrías de mi vida. Es el lugar donde yo he cantado, he hecho música, que es una de las cosas que más me gusta hacer en la vida. La música tradicional tiene un encanto especial.
Yeah.
De por sí la marimba es un instrumento muy espiritual, muy profundo.
Sí.
Es un instrumento en donde se ve toda esa majestuosidad de la naturaleza a través de la lluvia, porque lo que representa es eso, el agua. Los bombos son instrumentos de percusión que dan esa fuerza y conectan a través del golpe cucún, 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 bum, 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 con el corazón, el latido del corazón, y como viene también de la naturaleza.
Desafortunadamente en esta época tenemos violencia. Algunos los casos son...
Es muy fuerte porque lastimosamente a nuestro territorio o a nuestros territorios ha llegado la violencia.
Sí.
Violencia que nosotros no la hemos llevado ni generado al interior, sino que es una violencia que nos han importado. O la manera como nosotros hemos aprendido a resistir.
¿Pero dónde viene ese poder para resistir?
La música.
La música.
Y es que ante el dolor no nos queda sino cantar y danzar.
Yeah.
Yo le daré dos, una para el niño y otra para vos. Este niño quiere jugar porque no lo hace bailar. Este niño quiere jugar porque no lo hace bailar.
Cuéntanos ahora, ya tiene las canciones, está, bueno, como la reina de todo. ¿Qué quieres hacer? ¿Qué quieres ver para el futuro, los próximos años?
Escuela tenemos funcionando hace 20 años aquí en Cali. Nosotros estamos abrazando a niños en situación de vulnerabilidad.
Yeah.
Entonces, digamos como mi sueño inmediato y es una sede propia. El otro sueño es poder ver a mis niños y a muchos niños más que migran del Pacífico, que son caleños con padres de diferentes comunidades y territorios afro, que haya muchos niños cantando currulao, jugabonde, tocando marimba.
Yeah.
poder seguir logrando hacer esa articulación entre lo ancestral y lo moderno.
Ah, qué bonito. Bueno, seguro que va a realizar todo. No tengo duda.
Pues gracias por venir, por estar acá.
Placer.
Igualmente.
Right. Okay. So we'll jump in with Kim in a few minutes, but before we do that, I wanted to also introduce my homie. I first met Bernardo when he was working on a film a long time ago, well, not that long ago, about a publication in Tijuana, which is actually in my hometown in Mexico. And I thought, my gosh, someone's actually going to do something on the Reporteros, right? And it's an amazing film. And then also hearing that he was doing another documentary about a subject that's near and dear to me is the wine growing region in Napa and the farm workers up there who make that industry run, and showing us some really interesting characters about that industry in California. Bernardo Ruiz also, gosh, I wish this film would have come out just a few more weeks ahead because of the potential that it could have had, I think, on Tuesday. But that's just me saying this, right? Bernardo.
Thank you so much. I just had one question. How many folks in this room are independent producers, independent filmmakers, producers? So I think part of what I think would be valuable here, happy to share and talk about specifics of the work, but I'd love to just also be very transparent and share some information about what can be useful to you as you seek to make projects with public media. As Ricardo mentioned, in my case, I've been producing independent documentaries through my company since 2007. I've made films for American Experience, Independent Lens, POV. I've done standalone specials. I've done some children's programming. Very excited to see more of Kim's series because that is a woefully neglected and underreported piece of Latin American history and U.S. Latino history. I've also done a lot of commercial work. I've done commercials for Marriott, and I've done films for Participant before they closed up shop. I did an ESPN 30 for 30. I say this not to self-aggrandize, because A, as an independent documentary maker, you're kept humble, but two, just to say that we as independents have many choices, but why many of us continue to return to public media despite its many, many, many challenges, including lower budgets and a fight for visibility. Despite all of that, we return to public media because of the ethics, because of the rigor that's involved in making the work, also just a general alignment around mission and goals, to educate, to inform. It is not without its challenges, mainly dealing with budgets. We work with very lean budgets, and I'm happy to talk a lot of shit about that. But there are a few places where the goal is to inform and educate and to do kind of public affairs work, or to do experimental work in some cases. We've seen the crash and burn of the for-profit streamers. If you're like me, you've seen how the for-profit streamers talked a great game about increasing diversity. We saw them buy up a few films at very high price tags, but guess what? Market capital, hedge fund money doesn't give a shit about your film or your ideas. Those films, some of them have been pulled from for-profit streamers. I'll tell you, I've directed and produced 5 feature documentaries. I own the copyright to 4 of those. I sometimes have sold the derivative rights. I've done follow-ups. In the case of the film that Ricardo was talking about, I did a 2020 film with colleagues about the Latino vote during the pandemic. We just recently spent the last year filming in 8 states. We did a follow-up to that film on the Latino vote, which streamed October 9th, and it had a traditional broadcast October 22nd. I own the copyright to that film as well. So I say that, again, because you as filmmakers have a different set of rights when you work for public media. You're definitely going to work with lower budgets, but you have a different set of rights. You also have access to data that you don't with the for-profit streamers. Netflix recently released some of its streaming data. There was some good reporting about that. They've just decided that they're not going to share data for a while because there's no account. They're like, they don't have to. They're making so much money, they don't have to. Whereas public media, it's accountable to the public. It doesn't receive enough, money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and tax dollars. It needs more, but because of that, it has a different level of accountability. So that's my overall pitch, is that there's an importance and a value in producing as an independent to public media. There are many challenges that I'm happy to talk about, and clearly, we're facing a very significant challenge ahead. There's going to be many challenges across the board, but when it comes to public media, one of the targets has been diversity and has been public funding for media and for the arts. So we know that that's on the chopping block. There's concrete evidence to suggest that there's going to be a big effort to dismantle public media. I think it'll be hard to do because it's a bureaucracy and it's got many moving parts. And I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for PBS or public media. But I will say that as an independent, it's going to be important for us to push for and fight for public media, even as we offer some critiques of ways that it could get better.
So let's take a look at this clip. Will tell you a personal note. When I saw this, I wanted to pick up my late mother's chanclas and whip it at somebody. So.
In 2024, 1 out of every 5 Latino voters who are going to cast a ballot are going to be doing so for the first time in a presidential election.
That is a tsunami of new voters coming, meaning Latinos will be the decision makers in who becomes the next president of the United States.
Nobody speaks for the great diversity of Hispanics. We are Venezuelans and Cubans and Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and US-born Latinos.
So politicians in America, when they attempt to put Latinos in one block, good luck with that.
I believe that we are the future of the Republican Party because Hispanics have always been conservative.
A lot of people saying the Republicans are making all these inroads with Latinos, everybody's shifting to Republicans, but now with Kamala Harris, it's anybody's ballgame.
Latino evangelicals, we're exhausted of the polarization. We want immigration reform that treats people humanely.
People think that Latinos are extremely anti-abortion, but anytime there's an abortion issue on the ballot, that galvanizes Latinas to go out and vote.
The destiny of the United States is intertwined with the destiny of the Latino community like never before.
Latinos are turning out at historic numbers, and we are going to shift the direction of this country.
Okay, so that I think sets us up for a lot of interesting questions. And the first area I want to get into for the two filmmakers up here is, and the power of this, I think, is just that, again, we're not going to answer every one of the questions. We're not going to isolate all of the potential ways you can get into the public media platforms. But I just wanted to give you a couple of really strong personal stories of folks and how they've reached the point where they are today. So let me start by saying, are you happy with the success, quote unquote, that you've achieved at this point?
Oh, gosh. What a question. Thank you. I am happy to be here. And you know what? I'm really proud of what we have produced so far. So in that sense, absolutely. Because it gives people like Nydia, and I mean, there have been people who watch our first episodes on Costa Rica, and people write me and say, I had no idea there were blacks in Costa Rica. So already I feel like we're successful. If people don't know that black people are walking the earth, and they don't know that they existed in Costa Rica and other countries, that in and of itself is, for me, success.
I think we need a lot more. This is a room full of journalists and independents. we need more space on public media. We've seen what purely profit-driven media can do. We've seen the crash and burn of so many social media platforms. Public media doesn't move quickly, but it is reliable and accountable in a different way, and we're going to fight for it. We actually have Gordon Quinn walking in the room, who's one of the reasons why I have a career. Gordon, in addition to co-founding Cartemquin, is a reason why we have ITVS, which is the independent television service, which was created through an act of Congress in 1988. The reason, last year, as context, ITVS gave out $11.5 million to the field, directly into the pockets of independents and into independent productions. ITVS is not perfect. No system within public media is perfect. But in a few years, in 2028, it'll celebrate its 40th anniversary. It is a durable piece of independent documentary architecture. Ask yourself how many other pieces, how many other documentary funders have lasted nearly 40 years? I personally can't think of any. So when you think about success, I think ITVS is a success. I think series like POV, Point of View, Independent Lens, those are successes. When you all are thinking about the kinds of films you want to make, sometimes critical films, sometimes films that will take artistic risks, films that will piss people off but deserve to be told, they are going to be supported by places like ITVS, Independent Lens, and POV. I'm a pragmatist, so like Kim, I also like to make things that are going to be a mix of different things. You know, but we need this to protect this important space for independent films, and I think that is the fight ahead. And if you look at ITVS's history, I'll just say ITVS was created during and at the tail end of the Reagan era. There was nothing that suggested that independents would be able to achieve the kind of victory they did in 1988. And yet they did, because independents are nimble, we're flexible, and we also know that keeping a space for independence is going to be critical to, you know, to our democracy, to good journalism. So I think, to me, the success comes in building and expanding what we've done so that we can tell these types of stories, so that we can reach the types of audiences we did. I'm waiting to hear what the 2024 numbers are like for this 1-hour documentary we did. We know that in 2020, we had a traditional broadcast and streaming. We had, you know, just under 2 million views within the first week for, you know, traditional broadcast. Obviously, things will change this time around. But so I think those things are successes if you think about the infrastructure that's around us to give us a boost.
Great, great. And thanks for that. And I hope that y'all are generating your questions as you nosh on your sandwiches and so forth. But I want to get at, I keep saying 2 avenues, right? I've said that repeatedly so far. I'm going to identify what I think are the 2 avenues that are at play here, which can also be indicative of a broader universe of possible avenues. One is going through ITVS, going through that route, perhaps even Latino Public Broadcasting and other sources of traditional documentary funding, right? Kim's avenue is the local stations. Finding a representative station that's going to take you on and say, hey, we'll give you a green light for this pilot, or we'll actually help you try to set up a consortium of local stations that can perhaps fund, say, a few episodes of the first season. So then you start building something. I love that example because there are 350 local stations in this country who are starving for content. And another note to remember, PBS does not produce all of the content that you see on your local station. There is a tremendous amount of autonomy in these local stations. They can buy films, they can rent films, they can help you distribute films. And so there's this great network that could be created from that. I bring that up because there's an example of a station in far west Texas, Midland, Odessa. It has no budget for public affairs, really, so there's no news team. What do they do instead? There's an interesting film that comes from Frontline or an interesting documentary. They fire up a public forum at the local movie house. And the community comes out to see this. And it's an amazing success, I think, and a good example of what can be done to help put the word out about your independent projects and other projects that are on public media. It's in the same community that is the home to a billionaire, a Texas oil billionaire, who has 1,000 pink slime news sites across the country. These are news sites that sell disinformation and fake news. And it's this one guy who lives in the same community. So that is a potential. The route is that community route. So those are the two avenues that I really wanted to focus on. And so my question to you is, if you had to start all over again, would you go that route for both of you?
Oh, gosh. You know what, because I had the idea for Afro-Latino Travels at least 10, 11 years ago. And I started, once I learned about how PBS actually works, which was surprising, so I had to come up with the money for the show myself and produce it, which is not what I thought. So I went and pitched Miami Public Television because I thought, okay, it's a show about Latinos, go to Miami. And they liked the idea, but then there was no money. And so year after year after year, after so many years, I just kept, I have pitched everyone, and this is again, 10, 11 years ago. Corporations, foundations, airline, you name it, and I'm sure we pitched them, and no one was interested. And when I said, oh, it's a series that celebrates blacks in Latin America, Afro-Latinos, people looked at me like, what? There was no talk. People weren't using the term Afro-Latino 10, 11 years ago. There was no talk about Afro-Latinos, and it went nowhere. And so while I had Miami Public Television, who agreed to be a presenting station, in the PBS system, there was no money with it. And so fast forward several years, I was tired of talking about it. I was tired of talking about the show, the idea, the series, and finally a friend of mine said, you know what, you just have to produce it yourself. And I was tired of waiting. Waiting around for somebody to save me when it just wasn't happening. And so that's when I just decided, you know what, take my money, go shoot it, and just know that good things will happen as a result.
I think Kim's experiences of a piece, it's illustrative of the bigger challenge with public media. And I think a lot of local stations want material. They don't have resources, and sometimes they don't always understand what's possible looking at the future. I would say that the biggest benefit to public media, it's also its biggest challenge. So as an independent producer, you often have to raise money from outside sources. In the case of Latino Vote, I raised money from the Ford Foundation, from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, from ITVS, from Latino Public Broadcasting. Every project that goes to public media is cobbled together with sources of funding and some funding from PBS, some matching funding from PBS. I think that the benefit to that is that as a producer, you have some leverage because you've done the work of raising the money. I think the downside is you then are, as a producer, you have to coordinate and communicate with all of these different entities. It's a little bit like being a child of divorced parents who don't speak to one another. You have to translate back and forth, and it's a lot of coordination. Inevitably, something's gonna it fall through the cracks. It's a challenge to get all of these entities to work together. They each have their own separate bureaucracies. So more than half of the job, you have to make the film that you want to make, that you can be proud of, that you think will generate some kind of public impact, and then you have to manage all of these partners. So you have to manage up. That old rule, all money has personality. So every one of your individual funders is going to have a personality. In my case, I don't teach. I don't do anything that would allow me to have a stable income. I make my life exclusively as a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, which is like being a circus performer. It's ridiculous. But it has taught me to be wily, and in that case, you do need to be very strategic in how you harness the power of those partners and work with public media. I think the big question we all have is what's going to happen as we go forward. What types of pressures are going to be placed on public media going forward? What types of pressures about the type of content that's going to go on the air? And you just have to look at the history of PBS to see what's going to happen. I mean, so I think there are a lot of questions about what's coming next, and I think it's going to be a challenging period for independent producers.
I'd also kind of like to think that it's, I mean, if I were a local station general manager in the system, I would see this as an opportunity to look to my own community and say, hey, who's producing good content in our neighborhoods here? And how can we bring some of these folks to light? So if I were in your shoes out there, I would just start knocking on those local doors and saying, now do you love me? I mean, I think there's a chance here. I see it also as a challenge, yes, but an opportunity. So, okay, so with that, let's start raising some hands and see if we can get some questions asked and answered. All right. So, who's got a good question for me? The hat here with the sunglasses. Yeah. And tell me who you are too. Yeah.
I'm Dawn Langford. I'm an independent producer, and it is like a circus show over here. I'm on my second ITVS co-production deal, which is great, but I'm also used to working under budget. And so you named a lot of the big players that you've partnered with. Do you have any other ideas about who likes to play with ITVS? And then I'm also finding people who are scared to invest in PBS. Do you have any advice around that?
I'd love to have a conversation afterwards about who's scared to invest in PBS. I think the good news is that ITVS is in a very strong place, and they are great partners to work with. They're critical partners. So I think there's lots of support, lots of potential foundation support to partner with ITVS. Interestingly, I'm seeing more private equity in independent documentaries, which is a whole other ball of wax. I mean, anybody who's expecting a return on a documentary that's not a biopic or a true crime doc is, looking at something strange. I think we could talk more specific funders, but I think we're going to have to find new ways to protect and expand ITVS. I personally think there should be an increased appropriation for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and there needs to be increased funding for ITVS. That needs to be really expanded. And I'll tell you why. I've done independent productions that have been funded, co-produced with ITVS, and then also projects like this last one that are direct to the system. When you work with ITVS, you have an important public media ally, and you have an important relationship. It's like one very key partner. If you're producing to the system independently, you're at the whim of all of these different partners, and it's a much harder, the administrative burden is much higher if you're producing directly to the system. So I think a partner like ITVS is critical, and congrats to you for 2 projects in. Yeah.
Just let me say real quick housekeeping thing. We're going to be limited on time for sure, but one of the things I told both Bernardo and Kim was brace for impact, because after this, I'm hoping that it can stick around and y'all can queue up and ask them some more pointed questions perhaps in one corner or two at the venues here outside. So next question, back over here. And then we'll come up here next. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hey, sorry. Quick question. You talk about kind of cobbling together this support network of funding from different organizations like the Ford Foundation, that sort of thing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your pitching strategy with them and how you kind of identify which organizations are going to be most beneficial when you're looking at your projects.
It's a great question. What I've often done as an independent is look at the calendar ahead, that long, painful calendar of the next year, and just assemble a calendar of all of the deadlines, which funder needs a letter of inquiry, how much they need. Over the years, two different types of funds crop up for different things. So for instance, for the filmmaker who's in their second project, Firelight, which is a very important entity, has the William Greaves Fund, which is specifically for mid-career filmmakers who are second or more films in. And that's important just because that's a really hard place to be. It's hard to get that second or third project off the ground. So usually what I do is I have a calendar of funders, and then the reality is just a lot of it is trying to get meetings and sitting down with people and explaining projects. There are people who go to the trouble of making decks and doing all of that. My personal experience that it's really about the strength of the writing and the sample. You don't need this isn't unless you're selling to Netflix or some other places that do require having a lot of those things in place. It's different for foundations. Foundations want to know that you're going to be responsible, transparent, and that it's mission aligned in some way.
Oh, go ahead, Kim. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, we also received 3 grants from the Ford Foundation, and we were so fortunate. I don't know how to say it because we were just so lucky. I mean, I happened to be online during the pandemic. I had reached out to Ford many years ago, and I just happened to mention, the idea of the series, and we had already shot Costa Rica, and, the person in the managing the office, the Ford Foundation office, and this was out of Mexico, and she's like, "Oh, that sounds great." I mean, but this is after pitching for like 10 years. And, then one thing led to another, and within a couple of weeks, I had a grant. But, I mean, that is rare. And again, that's after 10 years of pitching everybody and anybody. So, but then since then, we've gotten, additional grants from Ford. But I haven't gotten a grant from the New York office, which is that's where the money is. And so it's taken me years just to get into the New York office. And I was there a couple weeks ago, and luckily I was able to be the keynote for Hispanic Heritage Month and share some of our footage and stuff. But I think for me, just only for my case, I can only speak about, I think because of the topic, because it is about Afro-Latinos specifically, I think that it's incredibly challenging. Right. I mean, I can't say that enough, how hard it is. And we still need money. Now we've got, we want to shoot in Brazil next year, Panama, Guatemala. There are blacks in all of these communities who are just incredibly marginalized and have contributed so much. So, I'm going to probably, it's challenging.
Right. We're going to have time for 2 more quick questions, but let me say something real quick about the pitch. I spend a lot of time at Kerry Lozano's invitation, among others, to help evaluate pitches and so forth. And I have to tell you, what Bernardo said is spot on. This is your one shot to show the folks in-house who might be able to help you with funding is your talent as a writer and as a producer and as a filmmaker. This is your one shot, is that pitch. So really focus in on that, okay? We had a question up here. Oh, are we done? Okay. All right. Well, we've been cut off. I feel the hook coming this way. I'm about to be jerked off the stage. But listen, keep asking questions. We're all here, all right? And if anything I can do is help explain the PBS system a lot more clearly to a lot of people who may not understand, who may have a question. Why can't I get someone to look at my product or look at the film I'm doing? Why isn't that happening? And I can perhaps help explain you why. And maybe we can find different ways of approaching the system. Right. Thank you.